Right now, a historic moment. We can now project the winner of the presidential race. CNN projects Donald Trump wins the presidency. The business tycoon and TV personality capping his improbable political journey with an astounding upset victory. Donald J. Trump will become the 45th president of the United States, defeating Hillary Clinton in a campaign unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. Donald Trump.
Many did not expect to hear those words, but looking more closely, we can see that much of the structure in politics and in culture that Trump needed to rise was already there before his name was ever mentioned. But just pinning his rise down to one cause simplifies things too much. Just saying that rural people feel abandoned and chose Trump for that reason, or Donald Trump rose because of uneducated people, or the collapse of the left created Donald Trump's victory, doesn't suffice. In reality, understanding Trump's rise relies on examining all these causes together and seeing how they interact. Although examining all of these would be too much for one video, I will look at one of these: nationalism. Nationalism has been on the rise recently, not just in the US, but also in several countries in Europe. By looking at the similarities and differences between those types of nationalism, we can more clearly see what phenomena in Trump's rise are related to things facing other places and what is specific to the US. What influences individuals to support nationalism, and how is this represented in both Europe and the US? It's also important to note that nationalism in and of itself is not necessarily related to feeling superior over other cultures. As Kamenka says, nationalism has a positive side and a negative side. It can be democratic or authoritarian, backward-looking or forward-looking, socialist or conservative, secular or religious, generous or chauvinist. Nationalism isn't in itself related to hatred and conservatism, even if the incarnation I talk about here is. Most nationalists today carry strong attitudes and beliefs about their own people and about others, feel their attachment to their nation passionately, and even at times act with great cruelty against their enemies, as Joshua Searle-White writes in his book, The Psychology of Nationalism. His book describes how nationalism psychologically bases itself in a need to improve the sense of self. And he explains the easiest way to do that is to compare ourselves to others and see us as better than them. This explains how one goes from loving their own country to hating people that aren't part of it. To an extent, thinking of yourself or your culture as great makes others seem less great. Trump exploits this need to improve the sense of self by appealing to political incorrectness. As Simon Western says in his paper about the relation between political correctness and authoritarianism, the politically incorrect tribe believe they are better and stronger than the inferior other. Their enjoyment comes from the experience of feeling dominant and superior. When a leader appears, such as Trump, to champion the cause, the grandiosity shifts from being quietly assumed to manically celebrated. Yet clearly, this enjoyment offers only a temporary reprieve from their inferiority complexes that are the underlying drivers of these compensation behaviors.
I think the big problem this country has is being politically correct.
This explains why individuals may feel like their culture is better than others. They improve their sense of self through comparing themselves favorably to others. However, it doesn't explain why this has been more common recently. What has changed? Well, most simply, our culture has. Since the turn of the century, there has been a shift in attitude. Wages have been stagnant recently, and the modern ideals of progress have been declining. A recent poll showed that over half of white respondents thought life in the US is worse today than it was 40 years ago. This implies that people are comparing the past to the present and seeing that it has gotten worse. So how does the future improve? By going back to that past. The gap they see between how they are and how they should have been, they feel, can be solved by going back to the way things used to be. The feeling that things aren't getting better also shows us why people might be more likely to take the anti-establishment candidate. When people are in a state of failure, they are more likely to take risks. When individuals feel like their lives aren't improving and they desperately need them to, they are more likely to go for a figure like Donald Trump, even if the change might not end up being positive. In addition, the culture itself might be conducive to reverting to authority. Going back to Simon Western's paper, the increasingly networked society and today's postmodern milieu leave us without the authority figure who once refereed in our minds. This causes blurred moral boundaries and a new law telling us our duty is to enjoy. Now everyone has to make their own choices around ethics, morals, and politics. Being overwhelmed by choices, a desire returns for someone or something to choose for us, a new leader. For some, the answer is to revert to nostalgia, to return to an idealized past of a harmonious society held together by a strong figure. This nostalgia of the past, the feeling that things have not been improving, and the need for a strong figure all set the perfect stage for nationalism with authority figures to rise. And the general characteristics of such a figure is represented in the leaders of nationalist movements all over the world. In Europe, they are Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage. In the US, it's Trump. So there are some striking similarities between Europe and the US in their timings, cultural appeals, and authority figures. As Lloyd Kramer says in his book about nationalism in Europe and the US, these similarities include the overlapping cultural patterns in European and American nationalisms that clearly challenge assumptions of American exceptionalism. American nationalists have promoted at one point or another almost every nationalist concept that ever appeared in Europe. Although we may think they are very different, they are really just different incarnations of the same phenomenon. Even though nationalism in the US might seem like a more recent phenomenon, most were not aware of its size until this election, whereas the rise has been happening for a few years now in Europe. Some of the values on which nationalism is based are even stronger in the US. A recent poll showed that almost half of Americans thought that their culture was superior to others, compared to only an average of 38% in the fourth largest European countries. Although those countries do have quite a wide range, implying that there is a lot more variation of opinions about this in Europe than just this one statistic implies, the general trend remains. And as we established earlier, this belief of cultural superiority is linked to nationalism. So why does nationalism seem so much more recent in the US? To answer that, we can simply look at the party system of the countries. Almost all European countries have multi-party systems, where a majority relies on a coalition of multiple parties. Because there are so many parties, it is easier to find out what the opinion of the population is. People normally vote for the party they agree with most. Thus, we can immediately notice an uptick in nationalism in recent years when people agree with those sentiments more. In the US, on the other hand, there are many reasons to vote for either of the two parties, and the fact that the nationalists generally just voted Republican made it harder to notice this increase. The two parties effectively hide the nuances of motivations to vote for either party. So now you know more about one of the reasons Trump became president. You know why people may feel nationalist ideals, why these have risen more recently, and why Europe is so similar yet so different. And hopefully you understand that it takes all these things to work together with so many other factors to create President Donald Trump. Thanks for watching.